Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Councils of Real Estate, welcome to our presentation of The Risky World of Geopolitics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Anthony Delapelle, CRE, the 2024 Global Chair of the Councils of Real Estate and a managing shareholder with the law firm of McCurdy, Riskin, Olson & Delapelle in northern New Jersey. The Councils of Real Estate is a distinguished international group of accomplished advisors addressing real estate challenges worldwide. Experienced, innovative, principled, and credentialed problem solvers, counselors reside in 22 countries, practice in many more, and offer expertise in 60 real estate disciplines across all asset classes. Each has earned the prestigious CRE designation. Let's recognize our 2024 sponsors: Busak Real Estate, Equus Capital Partners, J.P. Wygand & Sons, McCurdy, Riskin, Olson & Delapelle, and WPJ McCarthy & Company. Thank you all for your support. Before we begin, I'd like to offer you a free digital subscription to the Counselor's peer-reviewed professional journal, Real Estate Issues. It's been named as one of the top 10 essential real estate publications in the U.S. Please visit cre.org/REI to subscribe. Today, you're encouraged to utilize the Q&A feature should you wish to submit a question. Your participation is welcome, and we'll answer as many questions as time allows. At this point, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, David Levy, CRE, currently a consultant in portfolio management, research, and strategy. David was previously managing director with BGO, senior vice president and head of valuation for Bentall Kennedy, and managing director of Sun Life Financial, the parent of BGO. David was invited to membership in the counselors in 2014. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Tony. So I want to thank you all for joining today. We have an international real estate audience of almost 200 attendees. And I think the timing couldn't be more incredible for today's What's Next, the risky world of geopolitics. Geopolitical tensions and events are widespread across the globe, causing immense volatility, disruption, and uncertainty. And according to multiple CEO surveys, as well as the Counselor's outlook on the top 10 issues affecting real estate, geopolitical risk has been and continues to be a top concern for business leaders. And today, we're privileged to have Frank Kelly take us on a unique tour of the geopolitical risks around the globe and to unpack these major risks and provide us with some explanations of the potential impacts to the real estate industry. So a little background on Frank. Frank is the founder and managing partner of Fulcrum Macro Advisors. He has worked as a senior executive on Wall Street for over 30 years, most recently at Deutsche Bank. Prior to that, he held senior positions at numerous Wall Street firms, including Merrill Lynch, where he was chief of staff and global head of marketing. And at Deutsche Bank, he served as global coordinator for government and public affairs. He was also the bank's first political strategist, advising clients on geopolitical and domestic policy issues. And prior to joining the financial services sector, Frank was chief spokesman and senior policy advisor to the chairman of the U.S. SEC. And prior to that, he served as the U.S. Department of Justice in the Office of Policy Development, where he focused on international and national security issues. He began his career as a writer for President Ronald Reagan, going on to serve as the Deputy Associate Director of the Office of Public Political Affairs, and he remained at the White House to serve as a writer for President George Herbert Walker Bush. So I've known Frank for over a decade, and I've always been wowed by his insights and commentary. He presents frequently to leading institutional investors and corporations, and some may remember that 2 years ago, he was a keynote speaker at our CRE annual conference in Boston. So over the next hour, Frank's going to provide us with his views on the global political landscape and hopefully shed some light on what I think the elephant in the room, the U.S. presidential election taking place in just 6 days. I already have some questions for Frank, and more importantly, we want to hear from you. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to pose your questions to Frank as we go, and I'll try to do my best to have those answered in real time. So now I'm going to turn it over to Frank Kelly.
David, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining. I'm really honored by how many folks are here today. And I remember very fondly having an opportunity to be in Boston and to speak. And it was a lot of fun. It was quite an event. It's huge. Well, it certainly is so much going on, right? I find it's overwhelming. And if you feel overwhelmed, I say this as encouragement, don't feel alone. I talk to so many hedge fund managers, portfolio managers. They're just, there's not enough screens they can put in front of their desk to try and capture all this data of what's going on market wise, what's going on political here, and then what's going on geopolitically. But why don't I start with the geopolitical in a way here that sort of will drive, I hope, back to my view that so much of this election, so much of the economy now and where the economy is going to be going in the next 2 to 4 years are going to be are sort of predictable. David and I have been talking about these topics and what to talk about today. And in some ways, I do refer to it as sort of the chaos on one side, right? Everything you cannot pick up your phone, you can't turn on the TV, and it's crisis. It's the Middle East. It's North Koreans in Ukraine. What's going on in China, and of course, election. And it's sort of a chaotic swirl. But there is a calm out there from a market perspective that it's kind of boring. And it's to some, compared to this other stuff we're talking about, that is very much, I think, focused on the focus of it is commercial real estate. Is going to be the big beneficiary of it, particularly in the United States. So let's just start with China as an example. China is going through some brutal times right now economically. We read about it in these huge amounts of money that the government is now putting in there for stimulus. What you don't read about, because it's censored, just be blunt with everybody, right? If there's this much economic problem in this country of China, there has to be some reflection of that in terms of social discontent and political discontent. And I can tell you, I do a lot in the geopolitical space, and yes, there is. This is an ongoing struggle for President Xi of China. I point out that when he became president for the third term several years ago, unprecedented for any Chinese leader of third term of the presidency, he used the word security 93 times in his acceptance speech. And the markets were, oh, no, here it comes. It's the invasion of Taiwan, and it's going to be all sorts of tensions in the Indo-Pacific. He was actually talking probably much more about internal security. You look at two factors here that I think just sort of illuminate how bad things are. There are an estimated 90 million housing units, right? You guys know the definition better than I, apartments, standalone houses, whatever. 90 million housing units in China that will never be lived in, that have been constructed and will just lay empty. I've been there. I've seen cities, literally decent sized cities. They're not Milwaukee, they're not Los Angeles, but they're small cities, completely empty, all brand new, that were built up, and nobody will ever live there. And you talk about 90 million units. You're also looking at a demographic slide in that country, which is coming on now and really starting to hit. And David and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. Best example of this is if you are a 10-year-old child in China today, if you are lucky enough, you'll be in the year 2100, you'll be 85 years old. Currently, the population of China is 1.5 billion people. The median expectation, the median projections of where by the UN population agency, other demographers, the median expectation by 2100 will be just over 700 million people. So as a 10-year-old today, you will see your country by the time you're 85, literally half the size of what it is. That's stunning. They cannot incentivize people to have children. It's just, and it's going into demographic freefall. This is one of the reasons, of course, China is stressing technology so much, because the technology can make up for the loss of workers in terms of revenue, et cetera, et cetera. But you can see these are just, that's another example. And the last one is you look at the youth unemployment numbers. The government, last time they released the youth unemployment numbers, I believe it was July of this past July. And at the end of the press release said, we're not releasing this data anymore, which is another factor that is problematic for investors, is that Xi has basically cut off 70% of economic data that is normally published on China. And in that press release, they cited that youth unemployment, which is 16 to 22 years of age, no, 16 to 24, I believe, which that captures college graduates and even post-college graduates. These are more sophisticated than most, right? Many of them travel abroad, they've studied abroad, they've seen, as they might say, the big lights, big city. The number that they put out was 21.3% youth unemployment. Well, I talked to a friend of mine who is a senior intelligence analyst at in the US government who focuses on China, who tells me that real number at that point was between 35 and 40%. Now, by historical comparison, when Tiananmen Square happened back in the day, we all remember that tragedy, that was when youth were coming into the city of Beijing, looking at physical message boards that were up. People literally would post, signs that they were hiring somebody. So these youth flooded into the city, looking for jobs, and then were so frustrated that it turned into a democracy movement that turned into the government crushing them. The youth unemployment number, as I understand it, at that point was 10%. So you can imagine how problematic this would be inside China. Now, this has led Xi to significantly crack down on entrepreneurship, government control, et cetera, et cetera. But the impact on the US, and I would argue very much to commercial real estate, to get right to it, this is one of the driving reasons why the US Congress over the last 4 years passed the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and even the infrastructure bill. And I think this is enormous for the economy and certainly for commercial real estate. And just to tie this back in, this became a matter of national economic security. We cannot be buying our semiconductors from China, right? Because things have become more adversarial, because they're having these issues over there. We can't be completely relying on Taiwan because of the tensions between Taiwan and China. So bring it back. So the US government is incentivizing tens of billions of dollars to semiconductor manufacturers to do that. And we've seen some of this already announced. Intel announcing a $20 billion facility outside of Columbus, Ohio. Well, that's building from scratch. I remember doing the Google search for this, on mapping. Where is this? I figured it's downtown Columbus. Nope, it took me right to cornfields. So think of that in terms of commercial real estate, that is the supporting functions, supporting businesses for Intel. Higher end residential real estate, because people who work in semiconductor factories get paid more. What this does for the state revenue streams. That's just one example. You see Micron Technology in upstate New York is committed to $100 billion over 10 years. And again, this is with huge billions of dollars of government aid, US federal government aid. Now, what's very interesting about this to me, the US government has only spent 4% of the hundreds of billions of dollars they allocated for the CHIPS Act. Only 4%. This is enormous fiscal tailwind that is really going to start picking up in terms of power, if you will, blowing into the US economic sales. They've only spent 16% of the infrastructure bill. Only 6, because none of these things are shovel ready. None of them, right? They take planning. So you're going to see a lot more spending on this. Whoever, I would argue, whoever's the president of the United States, much of the economic script for their 4 years in office has already been written because of this. And lastly, the Inflation Reduction Act, they've spent less than 40% of it. Now, back to the geopolitics. There's China. You're seeing the rise of India as more and more manufacturing moves out of China and increasingly into India. Why? Because they're the largest country in the world now, and their average demographic wise, their average age is 33 years of age. They've got great education. Many of them speak English, right? So now there's the new superpower that nobody talks about is India. They just had elections, the largest democracy in the world. They just had elections in which over 800 million people voted over 6 weeks. That's extraordinary, right? Democracy is definitely not dead. They are increasingly aligning with the West. And by the West, I mean not only Europe, but Japan, let's put it this way, the free market democracies out there that we are aligned with. And they are more and more aligned with the US. You're going to see more and more Indian investment into the US as they bind themselves economically, politically, militarily, slowly but surely with the US. Because one of their greatest rivals, of course, is China. It's a bad relationship there. And the instability that could be potentially happen within the Indo-Pacific unless they're allied with the US. So you're going to beginning to see, and you're already starting to see this. I see this, if it's sort of the first harbinger, if you will, for the commercial real estate space, I would argue in some ways is when you start seeing the agricultural pickup, right? They're buying more and more agriculture. You're seeing the governor of Iowa took 40 senior agriculture executives over for 2 weeks to India, and they're buying soy and wheat. This is the harbinger of becoming more ingrained with the US, and they particularly want to do this in the tech sector. But again, this is the geopolitics driving investment into the US. Last thing I'll say on this from the chips perspective is that, and investment in tech overall, my prediction is this Congress over the next 4 years, maybe it takes a little bit longer, but I doubt it, are going to do more. They see how important, because of the geopolitical problems, what's happening in Russia, the Middle East, the risk to supply chains, as we're seeing with the Houthis in Yemen, taking aim at any commercial shipping, which has added at least 2 weeks of time for shipping. And the Houthis are likely to become more sophisticated in their ability to attack those ships. As the Iranians, as a proxy for Iran, they'll be able to reach deeper, further into the Indian Ocean, even with missiles and drones. These are risks. The U.S. Congress, again, under the auspices of quote unquote national economic security, we need to do more here. So what would that look like? Certainly, it's going to be in the pharmaceutical sector. Congress truly understands we're too dependent, again, on importation of even the most basic drugs. We saw this during COVID when we were so dependent on China for masks, for aspirin, for ventilators. We had to get, right? We need to bring it all back here. And therefore, there's going to have to be an incentive for that. So I would look to that. There's going to be in the biomed area and other important tech sectors, they will benefit from this as well. That Congress, again, building all this, and it's going to require more and more commercial real estate. Finally, I would say, we're looking at the explosion of data centers around the country. I live just outside of Loudoun, Virginia. It's about 20 minutes from me, which is, for many of you, if you haven't seen it, it is worth the tour. You've never seen more data centers in your life. But I will say this, and it goes hand in glove with the CHIPS Act and these other incentive practices. I recently was traveling across Iowa. I came into Davenport and drove to Cedar Rapids to the airport. And yes, it's beautiful farmland with a lot of corn, but suddenly you just see data center after data center after data center emerging there in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, beautiful Iowa. And I had a conversation there with the CEO of the largest electrical company. This is what is happening, is that you're seeing more data center activity moving to places like Iowa because the electricity is cheaper, they've got more space, it's cheaper to put staff in there, and they're being welcomed by the states. I think you're going to see much more of that and encouraged at the state level. This begs one last thing here, and it goes to electricity. This is increasingly a problem. And the estimate is that it's going to cost us at least $1 trillion to rewire the electrical systems in the United States. But we don't want just what we've had, right? It's been nice to have those nice sagging lines that we see driving mile after mile. We need better electrical lines. For any of you who are not familiar with this, I've learned, the basics of these electrical lines, why they need to be replaced, because they're copper. Because they're copper, they're heavy, and therefore they sag. And because they sag, the electrical current is slowed and not as much can be pushed through. We need new, more modern types of wiring, if you will, that requires a lot of critical minerals so that we can push more electricity and faster. You're already beginning to see that, and also the concerns about oil, or any other energy source that we're importing. We've certainly seen this in the last month with Microsoft, Google, BlackRock, other large corporations now announcing that they're investing in nuclear. I think you're going to see much more of that to come. That is a huge positive. Notice that you're not seeing any pushback from the federal government on that. It is quietly encouraging the large, well-funded, well-capitalized corporations like this to move forward to really get the nuclear power systems, if you will, built and moving as fast as possible. Again, I think this is going to be a huge, huge opportunity. And again, for commercial real estate, I have to think that's very positive. So as we continue to see the geopolitical risks, and I've talked about Russia, look, that is not going to get any better anytime soon. 10,000 North Korean troops now being deployed as mercenaries to fight against Ukrainians. That in many ways is a cry for help, if you will, or shows the desperation of Putin, because he's afraid to do general conscription because there will be a revolt among the people if he actually does that. And the Russians have been losing on average 1,000 troops a week. The estimates are over 600,000 dead Russians at this point. And for what? Right now, the Ukrainians have lost a tremendous amount as well. So they are both sort of bleeding out, unfortunately, in terms of on both sides. But I don't see that ending anytime soon. And it is very problematic that the North Koreans are there. Interestingly enough, I'll say as a footnote, who really is unhappy about this is the Chinese. Chinese do not like seeing the North Koreans there because this is allowing Kim Jong-un off the leash, right? They try and keep him as contained as much as possible. But he went and did this without the permission or asking or consultation with Beijing. Plus, he's selling enormous amounts of armaments to the Russians. This worries China that North Korea could do something destabilizing in northern Asia, either with South Korea or with Japanese or anything. They're worried about that. That's not going to end anytime soon. And I would say for the Middle East, I don't think we're going to see unfortunately, any sort of brokered peace, long-term peace imminently. There's efforts now in the UAE to try and broker a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, but even if you do that, I don't know what the future of Gaza is, and I'm not quite certain, and most Washington policymakers I've talked to don't know if Israel even knows what the long-term strategy is to deal with Gaza. Do you let everybody back in? How do you make sure that Hamas has been actually crushed? It's going to be a problem. And then with Hezbollah, the Israelis are going to just keep doing what they feel they need to do until they have basically bludgeoned Hezbollah into being a minor threat to them and nothing more than that. So there may be some peace accords. The good news is I don't see Iran actually engaging in war or wanting to go to war with Israel, only because Iran is so economically and socially brittle and fragile. I was telling David the other week that my view is that if talking to Washington folks who are very focused on this and are aware of it, if Iran were to go to war with Israel, it would be something like watching the Tsar going to war with the Germans in 1917. It would actually provoke a civil war and civil strife that they wouldn't be able to control at home. So we're going to continue to see these problems globally, but again, making the U.S. an investment focused, I think globally as a safe haven, commercial real estate being the beneficiary because of the national economic concerns that we have. And again, like the CHIPS Act, and I believe there's more to come. And as we're going to see our allies wanting to invest more in the United States to cement that relationship politically, militarily, economically, socially, India being the big one. That's what I'm going to watch for. David, I probably have spoken for
Yeah.
long. Let's-
No, I was just going to say, you've made reference to a new multipolar world, and that's been dancing around a lot of what you've said. The outcome is a lot of asymmetrical warfare potential. You want to talk about that a little bit?
And this is certainly a commercial real estate issue. We've certainly seen the risks or the warnings that have come from Homeland Security. Microsoft has a superb center for cybersecurity. But I think the asymmetric risk here, the first really big one, is now that North Korea has given troops, 10,000 troops to Russia. This is a game changer of sorts, right? This is a significant expansion of the war and sort of changing the rules, if there really are rules of war. Meaning, Ukraine is now asking the United States and the NATO allies, and even now talking to South Korea about getting weapons, right? So there's an expansion here. But the big expansion risk is Ukraine wants NATO and the United States to give them permission to, on their own, unauthorized, strike Russian targets inside Russia. Up until this point, they've not been allowed to use any NATO weaponry, meaning they just can't take out, they see a troop train or a train of ammunition coming from northern Russia down into Crimea, right? That and to arm, troops, they can't just strike them if it's in Russian territory with those NATO weapons. They're asking for unfettered use of those weapons, even to potentially strike Moscow. Putin has said, you do that, then I'm coming after the NATO countries. But he won't come after the NATO countries with troops or planes. He will almost assuredly asymmetric warfare, as David has pointed out to. So what are we talking about? Cutting communications cables, damaging or destroying critical communications satellites. And this was something that came up over the summertime, where we were finding out that the Russians were arming their satellites with nuclear weapons. The only purpose of that was to destroy other satellites, particularly ours. Massive cyber attacks on energy grids, particularly electrical energy grids. And I'm not just talking about the risk here is not just Europe, it's the United States as well. And of course, the really big one is some sort of massive cyber attacks on a scale that we haven't seen before. Now, the important thing is US intelligence, NATO intelligence, anybody who's supporting Japanese, South Koreans, because they're all now supporting Ukraine, they know this is a risk. They're working to mitigate it, to block it. They're looking for it, right? They're their own version of see something, say something. But this is certainly for commercial real estate a serious risk. And as these things ramp up with the North Koreans there, I believe that Biden and NATO are going to grant Ukraine the ability to strike like that. And that will be the game changer. That will be the flag for all of us to be really watching our backs at our businesses.
Brian, do you see a buildup of the military? I know there have been some studies recently about that, and I kind of liken that to the Reagan years when there was a big buildup in the military and the outcome or the impact on real estate as well. What?
I do. I think there's going to be. I think if Trump's elected, there's going to be a huge push to build up the military. Right. This is something Trump has promised a lot, not only just in terms of technology and weaponry, but he'll want higher pay for enlisted. As unemployment numbers, if they go up at all, that is always a big incentive. Education opportunities. So yes, I think this is we're clearly at a low point in terms of recruitment, and because of other budgetary problems, the defense budget has been flat to down. And there is so much pressure now to really kick it into gear. And we can't fool around with this anymore. And it goes back to the national economic risk of China. Well, got to finish that conversion from fighting, being prepared to fight land wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan to being prepared in Asia, the Indo-Pacific, which means a significant ramp up of all sorts of systems, all sorts of, right, they'll be very tech heavy in terms of satellites and missiles. The Navy will be important, but yes, I think that's going to be huge.
And what about, so we've talked a multipolar world. What about BRICS and BRICS Plus? I mean, they just had their meeting and it didn't turn out the way as anticipated. Well, what is the future of those alignments?
Yeah, I'm always wary of people who are scoffing at the BRICS. I was reading something today about the BRICS being a paper tiger by a certain some economists who I very much respect. It may be a paper tiger until it's not, right? The BRICS went from just those countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that there's more than 30 countries, including Saudi Arabia, who are members at this point. And they're looking to add 30 more. They currently constitute more than half the population of the world. Right. So there is that, but many of the economies are a basket case, and they really want to dethrone the dollar. And that's what, no matter what Putin says, that's really what it's about. Because if you dethrone the dollar, then China and Russia, Iran, who's a member, any of some of these other bad actors who are members, can escape sanctions and tariffs, which are imposed using the dollar. So they want to create a BRICS currency or an alternate currency. They were hoping to establish a real petro yuan currency for purchasing oil from the Middle East and elsewhere. It all kind of failed. But I think it failed because many of these countries are sort of in a wait and see mode. Where's the US going? Is it really going to be chaotic as it seems when I turn on the television, right? Of Trump and Harris, and Trump may win. Is it going to be crazy? Are we watching the demise of the US or not? And do I really want to be? I want to see, if I'm India, who is a major player in all this and probably the strongest economy out of any of them. Russia is a dying country, right? Their population is decreasing so fast. Their population by the year 2050 will be smaller than Mexico's. They're the largest landmass country in the world. You're looking at China with all the issues. Let's kind of wait and see where we are in 2 years. And I think that is what markets and observers are missing here. That many of these countries, yes, India wants to be our ally, but they're not just going to throw themselves into us. They're going to hedge their bets, as we would hedge our bets. And any country would hedge their bets, right? They are going to be careful of this. So I keep my eye on the BRICS very closely because they are doing so much more than just meeting once a year. If you Google BRICS, and you can actually find the official BRICS website to see the amount of meetings that are taking place constantly, where they're integrating and working amongst themselves outside of all of us, the United States, and all other Western countries, everything from healthcare to law to national security to agriculture, right? They are really integrating themselves in ways that I think would surprise a lot of people.
Frank, I've had a couple of questions come in. So curious what the impact of wealth moving out of the UK to other countries in Europe, like Italy.
Yeah, I mean, with the budget was just announced today. It's clearly going to be higher taxes on corporates, and I haven't read all the details of Chancellor Exchequer Reeves presenting that first Labour Party, I believe, budget in 14 years. Look, I think it's going to be a move to. I'm not certain where you go. Do you go to France, which is raising taxes because their economy is pretty messy, and certainly their politics, talk about a messy split, right? You've got a government that is sort of, it started out on life support. They could barely cobble together some sort of compromise government, which could fall anytime in the next year. I think they would have called a second round of snap elections, but under French constitutional law, they have to wait a year until right? So everybody's just like looking at their watch. When's the next set of elections coming? So is it France? Is it Germany, which is having economic problems and taxes are likely to go up there? Or do you go to Italy, where you see significant growth and a much more free market Prime Minister Maloney, but also has serious debt issues. Or do you come to the United States, right? Or do you wait and see how the elections that are going to happen next year, where conservatives are likely to sweep to power in Canada, right? And you could see some serious opportunity and changes there. Canada, I think, is also a big beneficiary of all of this reshoring and nearshoring. And with the natural resources they have, particularly of critical minerals, you're going to see a lot of investment there. And if the conservatives sweep in, they are going to push for that really hard. So, but to your question, if you're the UK, I'm not quite certain where you go, other than the United States, maybe Australia.
Another one has come in with all the risk and countermeasures. How does all this affect the inflation projections? Is this going to be an inflationary force?
Well, I do worry a little bit in terms of all of this, the money from chips and the infrastructure bill. Potentially that could be inflationary. And all of these risks, right? I mean, I think we do risk an inflationary impact if there is some sort of, God forbid, massive grid blackout or something else happens. I worry about that a lot, but I don't know what anybody could do about this at this point, other than we just are heightening our national security, homeland security standards, which, back to commercial real estate, maybe this is a bit of a stretch. I think cybersecurity is going to become so dominant in national security circles. And of course, that is a lot of data centers. That's a lot of tech centers, et cetera, right? But I other than that, I don't know.
Another question related to domestic. So we haven't really talked about the US election yet, but from a policy standpoint, what do you think the odds of a tax on unrealized capital gains on investments happening?
This is always
critical to real estate.
David, this is always my little slide trick these days, because this election is just, I try and like run the clock out. I'm like Dean Smith when he was coach of University of North Carolina. Remember, he used to do the four corners and they'd run out the clock, and sometimes the game scores were like 8-4. Okay, here we go. Unrealized gains, I don't think happens for two reasons. One, I think Republicans are going to win control of the Senate. I would say that with 70% certainty. And I'm watching most particularly as the canaries for the coal mine, if you will, of Republicans winning. It's Ohio and Montana. But I'm also watching increasingly Wisconsin. Republicans are going to win in West Virginia. I just think there's too many Democratic seats in red states, Republican states, and I don't see any real Republicans at risk of losing other than Ted Cruz in Texas. It's uncomfortably close because Texas is less Republican than it was prior to COVID. That's one of the reasons, but I think he still wins. So that's one, because Republicans would block that. And I think, and to predictions, I think Democrats are going to win control of the House of Representatives, only because there's such a slim majority for Republicans now. They're up by about three or four seats. And with redistricting that took place, New York, California, and a couple other states that basically created Democratic districts, you're going to see probably a slim majority for Democrats in the House. But that, I would say 50 to 55% confidence in that. As long as Republicans take the Senate, unrealized gains don't happen. The only way it happens is if somehow Harris wins the White House, Democrats win the House, and somehow Democrats hold on to the Senate and sweep. At that point, Harris, I would argue, rightfully will claim that she has a mandate. And they have to get tax legislation done next year, which she has been in favor of taxing unrealized gains. It would pass very quickly through the House because you can't filibuster it. It would go to the Senate. Republicans would filibuster that bill, to which the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, has been threatening for 3.5 years now. He wants to get rid of the filibuster because he feels it has held back too much progress. And only 2 Democratic senators have blocked him. John Tester from Montana and Joe Manchin from West Virginia. Manchin's retiring and being replaced by a Republican, and Tester's likely to lose. So if they hold on by a 1-seat majority, so if they got it, they'll get rid of the filibuster very quickly, right, to fulfill the mandate. And at that point, anything that, that will be a very progressive Democratic tax bill that will pass.
Before we get deeper into the US elections, can we step back? This year, globally was kind of a unprecedented election year, right? Across 78 or more nations.
Yes.
What has been sort of is there a general theme or themes of concern and dissatisfaction, or what has been the outcome of those?
I would argue that in many ways, voters globally are better educated about the issues and what's going on, and they're losing patience. So, meaning, look at the UK. The Conservatives had been in power, and countries had been in recession. It's got all these issues. Hey, what's the plan? I don't see a plan. We're kicking you out, and we're sweeping the Labour Party in. You look at France, where it went initially the other way in the first round of elections, where the far right, Marine Le Pen's party, looked like they were going to actually dominate the parliament. And then the second round of elections evened it out, but even created more because people were worried about the far right. And now is made sort of a crisis situation where it's sort of even of the far left, far right, and they're supposed to come up with a budget. And Macron is sort of, as president, throwing his hands up. I would look at Germany as a good example of the rise of the AfD, which has neo-Nazi sympathies, right? That's been the accusation. And I think considering what some of their senior members have said and done, yeah. And that's in the eastern part of Germany, which is sort of shocking to people because, one, these people had suffered so long under communism, right? There's still a lot of people who East German grew up in East Germany. And second, in East Germany, in places like Leipzig, you're seeing massive build out of the tech sector. Leipzig is like turning into, it is Germany's and a good part of the EU's semiconductor manufacturing facilities, right? Sort of. So can you imagine Silicon Valley turning far right neo-Nazi sympathizing? It's kind of weird, but they're so sick of what's been going on and the inability of the government to get things done. Lastly, I'd say, look at India, where everybody expected incumbent Prime Minister Modi to sweep and pick up seats. Every prediction, he was going to pick up seats in the parliament, which is leave him unfettered for all sorts of massive reforms of state versus federal level. And it didn't happen. And it actually lost seats, which was a shock to people, because they didn't like many of his policies. He was too nationalistic. There are host of reasons, but people are pushing back. They're dissatisfied with the way that of economic policy, if you will, in all of these countries. And I think that's one of the reasons we have this really extraordinary situation in the United States of a 50-50 country of Donald Trump, MAGA populist right, and Kamala Harris, who is by record, looking at her in the Senate and in the as Attorney General in California, she's a progressive Democrat. She is it just is what it is, right? She was the one she wanted universal health care. She proposed that legislation. She wanted to put a tax on every debt, equity, and derivatives trade, legislation introduced in 2019. I think she naturally done, and that's fine. There's no problem. But talk about a dichotomy politically, and that our country is that divided. It goes to show that people are really yearning for some sort of change, particularly on the economic front. One last thing, I would also argue that the subset to all of this, immigration. Immigration was a major issue in the UK. Immigration is a major issue in Germany. Immigration in France. Immigration in the United States. Not so much in India, but in many of these other races, immigration. And that's because we're seeing a great migration as demographies in Europe, even in places like South Korea and Japan, right? They have to bring in immigrants. And that is socially very upsetting to a lot of people, but they don't have a choice. Got to have workers.
Well, questions come in. I want to go back to your comments about the fraction of funds that have been allocated or spent in the CHIPS Act and infrastructure bill. So how do you propose that we do that given our debt to GDP ratio of 123%, and that we also have to rebuild our defense industry? How can we further weaken our currency and hold on to its status as a reserve currency?
A damn good question.
Yeah.
On the CHIPS money and infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Act, it's already been allocated. So it's already there, right? And I don't see Congress clawing it back. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was the most controversial, and all the Republicans voted against it. The Biden administration had a concerted effort to drill in the Inflation Reduction Act programs that have been implemented already in red states. The view being, if we drill them into the, Arkansas and Alabama, right, the governors will say, if Congress comes back and wants to repeal it, whoa, this is good for our state. I think that's true. And I think the CHIPS Act, the most dangerous place between either President Trump or President Harris and one of those gold-plated shovels that you use for, groundbreaking events is the most dangerous place is standing anywhere between them and those shovels, because either of them are going to be racing for those shovels. We're creating high-paying jobs. They're never going to push for that. And the infrastructure, no way. So it is what it is. I think they leave it alone. I think the big question is, how do we get the deficit under control without entitlement reform, right? And that's really driving it. And Congress is locked in this cycle of 2 years. Every 2 years, the House is up, entire 435 members, and 33, 1/3 of the Senate is up. So nobody wants to start talking about entitlement reform because it's the fastest way to be unemployed, right? I'm more wedded to the idea that has bubbled up in Washington and has actually been proposed by some very powerful Republicans and supported by Democrats, basically saying, we can't fix this ourselves. We're incapable of it. Pathetically, we can't do our job. So let's do what the military ended up pushing us to do, because we couldn't figure out how to close military bases a decade or more ago. Let's create a commission, the Military Base Closing Commission. We got a bunch of experts. We will pass legislation to create this commission, and these people will be on it. But here's the deal. Whatever they propose and say, this is the basis to close, you can't cherry pick. Congress votes up or down on it. So based off that, the legislation that has been proposed and they're talking about, let's create a commission. Ben Bernanke, Jay Powell, who will be out of here in 2026, which we should talk about. Let's put the smart guys in there and they tell us how to fix it, right? How to fix Social Security, Medicare, Highway Trust Fund, and also get the deficit under control. And then we have to vote on it. That gives every elected official some sort of buffer with voters. I wanted to vote against it, and I kind of did, but there were that, right? But the commission said, I think that's where they're likely to go. And they're going to have to do it, particularly as we see the BRICS slowly coming at us. Cannot have dollar deterioration. The deficit is a national security problem now. To the great question that was just asked, how do you rebuild the military if you got this deficit?
I'm glad you brought that up. My next question was going to be about central bank policy, particularly the Fed. So what is your opinion on so Chair Powell is not likely to be in the next administration. What's your view?
By the way, David, this is pure vodka at this point. This time of election year, it's the only way I get by. No, it's just water, everybody. I think the great thing about Jay Powell, which it has been written somewhat a little bit out there. And I was interviewed by Fortune magazine a couple of weeks ago, and I keep making this point. Jay Powell knows he's not coming back. His term is up in 2026. I think if Trump's elected, he doesn't fire him. He can't. The only way he can fire him, as I understand it, is just like for some sort of gross, criminal
Right.
type thing. And Kamala Harris isn't going to reappoint him because she led the fight to defeat his confirmation the first time he was nominated by President Trump. She was one of 9 senators who voted against him. She was very outspoken in opposition to him. So the whole concept of Fed independence, we've never, I would argue right now and through 2026, we will not ever see such an independent Fed. Because the chairman is going to be, his whole thing is we're going to get rates down, unemployment low, fix the economy, the softest of landings. He takes a bow, drops the microphone, and walks off stage. And he's happy to do it at that point. That begs the question, who will be the next Fed chair? This is the great parlor game in Washington, who gets what job in a Harris administration or Trump administration. But I almost 100% certainty, and I rarely say that, Powell will not be there after 2026. And of the other Fed governors, I don't see any of them leaving. None of their terms are up except Kugler, and hers is up in January of 2026.
So we already talked about potential for tax reform post-election with carried interest. What about some other ones that are pretty big, like SALT or tax incentives for nearshoring or the wealth tax or billionaire tax?
Well, we talked about the unearned aspect, and I've carried interest thing. I've always been like, this is the year it's going to die, and somehow it always survives. It's like something out of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. It's sort of like keeps popping up. Here it is again. But I have to think, right, where this perfect storm is upon us in terms of tax reform, concerned about Social Security, concerned about Medicare, concerned about highway, right, deficit. I think carried interest could get whacked, certainly if Harris wins. If Trump wins, I think it's more likely to survive. I also think that regardless of who wins, there'll be incentives, positive tax provisions. I don't know how that will look for the commercial real estate side, because commercial real estate has been struggling post-COVID, right? You don't want to be sticking it to this critical industry, which is so important to retirement planning, right? How many pension plans are invested in the sector, right? I think Washington gets the connections there. I do think estate tax is at risk, regardless of who wins. That Congress could say, okay, boomers, we gave you this amount for so long, but we need to tighten the belt a bit, and we're going to have to lower the amount that is allowed. And I think certainly if Harris wins, high net worth individuals, we're going to see rates go up and corporate tax rates go up. With Trump, I think for Trump, if he wins, he's going to have to negotiate with the House, and I don't know what he gives up. He'll be willing to give up SALT, right? He's flipped on that. Remember, SALT was created, this whole SALT problem, by Trump. And one of the reasons, because I remember meeting with Treasury officials when this came up. The president is sick of all these blue state, people living in the blue states, and they keep voting all these Democrats in, and then get this great tax deduction. We're going to take it away from them, and let's watch them all move. Well, then COVID hit. Well, I don't know what happened there. Now he's in favor of it. But SALT is going to continue to have a serious problem with the progressive Democrats, which are going to be a sizable block either in the House or the Senate, because as Bernie Sanders says, it is nothing more than a giant tax break for the wealthy. And this is why Biden couldn't get it through, even though all of these states are Democratic states, New York, Kathy Hochul and Gavin Newsom in California, pleading to allow the SALT caps to be taken off, but the progressives won't let it happen. That will be the big challenge there. Did I miss any that you asked about? No?
Well, we got about 5 minutes left. I know we're in the delay now because you don't want to talk about the election.
The last 5 minutes of Dean Smith.
Yeah.
Look, I'll say this. I've said what I've said about, I think the House flips Democrat and the Senate flips Republican, which I think will be positive for commercial real estate overall. You want the gridlock, and you're going to want the Republicans running the Senate that will be, disinclined to hurt commercial real estate and raise any significant corporate tax rates or even individual rates. I think on the presidential side, one, polling is terrible. I'm just shocked we're at this again, right? The perfect example of this is that why is the New York Times and Siena College, they team up and do these great polling, but why do they keep doing national polls? Who cares, right? We don't elect a president nationally. Yes, Hillary Clinton won the national vote, but she lost the Electoral College. Could you please go and New York Times, go poll all the steel workers in Western Pennsylvania and tell us what they're doing, because you're beginning to see these weird subterranean, I would argue, water shifts, right? Like underground rivers shifting. The unions moving to Trump in a very strong way. Hence the Teamsters not endorsing, the firefighters not endorsing. There's data out there that I've seen that suggests 50% of the auto workers are going to vote for Trump, despite the fact that Biden walked the picket line with him. They are not identifying with Harris. But the other big subterranean is the women vote, right? They don't want to talk about this. They don't want to be polled about it. But they're not happy about the Dobbs decision, and they don't like Trump for the lifestyle that he's lived. And, this is where the New York case and Stormy Daniels comes in. They were just the discuss factor. But it's very hard to get either, into those two segments to see where they're going to go. And does one swamp the other? And then you get these things that have happened, certainly in the last 72 hours plus, the Madison Square Garden joke, horrible joke about Puerto Ricans, and then Biden last night calling supporters of Trump garbage. Oh, good Lord, right? It's just like you've just turbocharged the entire base of Trump and others. So, and then there's 500,000 Puerto Ricans who live in Pennsylvania. So these are these cross currents. It's very hard to read. I think, quite frankly, Trump is still slightly ahead. And it's all going to come down to Pennsylvania. And whoever wins Pennsylvania, 85% certainty is going to be the president. Now, what to watch for an election night? A couple of things. I would watch Florida. Trump's almost certainly going to win Florida, but how soon do they call it? And how large a margin does he win by? That will be an interesting indicator of how strong he'll be elsewhere. If it's weaker than expected, he may have a problem in Pennsylvania. Then I'd watch North Carolina, where Harris has been very close to him. I think he's going to win North Carolina, but if he doesn't, he's going to have a bad night. I would watch New Hampshire, because the Trump people think that they can win New Hampshire now, which is much more purple-blue than it used to be 20 years ago. If he wins New Hampshire, it's going to be a bad night for Harris. And these are all on East Coast times. And then you move into Pennsylvania. Of course, that's on East Coast time. But Pennsylvania is not counting all of the votes that are coming in. They're not going to start counting all of the early ballots until the polls close Tuesday night. I would be shocked, considering how close this is, if we know by 8 a.m. Wednesday who has won Pennsylvania. And the legal challenges, this is a good time to be a lawyer and jump into election law, because you will be employed for months and months. I also think it's going to be hard to know who has control of the House, probably for days and maybe even weeks, because a lot of those House races are going to be contested. But for now, Democrats win the House, Republicans win the Senate, and by the slightest of margins, and almost like you better get the microscope out to measure what I'm holding here, Trump is ahead in Pennsylvania, which would mean that he would be the president. But that could
in 6 states. Yeah.
tomorrow.
Frank, thank you for another rich hour. Really appreciate it. I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
Thanks so much, David, for moderating, and especially to Frank for your insights and comments. I think one of the things that we've all realized, not just within our organization, but those, just in general, is that uncertainty is everywhere, right? There's uncertainty in politics. There's uncertainty in the international economies. Things are changing. There's more risk. There's more unknowns. And the issues that you discussed today happen to be two of the top 10 issues that were in our annual top 10 issues in real estate report. Global elections being number one and geopolitics being number four. And obviously they're related in so many ways. And they affect all of us and how we live our lives. They also affect the real estate markets and industries, both here in our country and elsewhere. So thank you so much for your presentation. Welcome back. We hope that we can get you back again another time in the future, and appreciate your time. Please join us as our fall series of webinars continues on November 20th. The next one is medical office. Is it what the doctor ordered? You may register at CRE.org. Until then, on behalf of the Councils of Real Estate, thank you for attending this session of What's Next for Real Estate and the Life Experience. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Great job, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.